Tonight, what I thought I'd do is there's a lot of faces that I recognize from church, but I don't recognize from last night. So what I would do is maybe just take a couple minutes to go through some of the highlights of what we talked about last night as a foundation for what we want to talk about tonight. I think there's some important concepts. And so what I want to start with is this. Actually, I'll just review this real quick. Last night, we talked about God is a planner. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means, because the Bible tells us some really important things about how God looks at what we should be doing as well, in addition to who He is. Tonight, once we get through that, talking about God as a planner, and by extension, we should be as well, we're going to talk specifically about mastering debt. Remember, one of the things I mentioned at church today, that the Bible says you cannot serve God and money. That doesn't mean that you can't serve God and have money. The Bible never says that, but you can't serve both. So one of the things we want to be on top of, one of the ways that we find that money is our master more than anything else is debt. So how do we get on top of debt so that we're mastering it rather than it being our master? And then tomorrow we're going to be talking about making sense, both sense from an understanding and sense in terms of being productive. How can we make money be productive with our savings in our investments? So we'll be talking about that tomorrow. But to go back just a little bit to what we were talking about last night, I mentioned the fact this is very interesting about people and human nature. And that is that people seldom take the financial advice from a financial planner, even if they've paid an hourly rate to get it. Now, doesn't that seem kind of odd? Like people go and say, hey, financial planner, I really need some assistance. Can you tell us what to do? I'm willing to pay you to tell me what we should do to get on track. And so the financial planner says, no problem, you give me the information. We're going to go through all this. And the planner comes back and says, this is what you need to do. And the people say, thank you so much. And they go home and they don't do it. Not a few, the majority do not do it. And the question is, why is that? Why would someone pay for advice but not actually follow the advice? And there's a number of reasons. Sometimes they say, well, the advice from an authority can be rather threatening, and they don't want to be threatened. They need evidence of the benefit. Yeah, the planner told me I should do this, but I can't really see if it's going to be a benefit for me or not. They want advice that matches their values, and they may say, well, this guy had a lot of information, but it doesn't really match my values, so I don't want to follow it. They think they know better, and this is something really all of us, I think, struggle with if we're honest. It's hard to admit that we're wrong, isn't it? Okay, I'm going to stop. It's hard for me to admit that I'm wrong, and what I found in my life as I get older and older is that I'm not that much different from people. So maybe there's a couple others of you here that feel the same way. Sometimes people can't commit to helping themselves, and finally, they may fear the results. But here's what my thought is, and studies have shown that these are the responses. The reason is because people have an emotional relationship with money. And I'll tell you one of the things that was so profound in my career. This is a statement. There are things so deeply personal that they can be revealed only to strangers. There was a gentleman that was doing a conference, there was a conference, and he was one of the speakers. He was, I think, a sociologist. He has been in counseling for a number of years. And he talked about the fact that he often counseled with husbands and wives. And one of the things he found in that counseling, and you can imagine that a lot of times finances can be a source of stress with couples, and so that would come up in the interactions and the counseling sessions that he would have. And what he found out is that, and he told us this, people would rather talk about their love life, their sex life. They would rather talk about that with a stranger than to talk about their money. That tells you how deeply personal money is. And so one of the things we have to realize is that all of us here, we love to think that we're just very rational, logical people. Hey, show me some information, I'm going to follow that. But the reality is all of us have some kind of emotional attachment to money based on our experiences either growing up or in our adulthood. Things have happened in our life where money becomes more than just a neutral exchange. And they've done studies and they found that people will often say, well, money, what does that represent to you? Well, it loves safety and security. Money, if I had enough money, I could be safe and secure. If I had enough money, I could pursue my dreams. If I had enough money, I would have love. Let me ask you guys something. Do you think that the wealthiest people in America only have people with them because they love them? No. The studies show that's one of the huge challenges with especially the super wealthy, is that they don't know, do people like me for who I am? Do they really love me for who I am? Or do they just want my money? So the question is, having more money, will that really bring true love? It doesn't. And in fact, having more money, I use the example, if you took a suitcase full of money and you walked to probably one of the, every city, by the way, has crime. We recognize that. I'm not trying to, but if you walk to one of the areas where maybe there was the most crime in the city with a suitcase full of money and a sign that says that your suitcase was full of money, do you think you would feel more safe and secure? No, we wouldn't. So just having money doesn't necessarily make us more safe and secure. Just having money doesn't bring us love. But we have this idea that that's what money should do. But here's the reality of what money is. What actually is money? Money itself is neutral. All right? Money itself is both good and bad. It's how we use it. And by the way, the Bible says that the love of money is the root of all evil, right? Love that means our relationship to money is what the problem is. The money is not the problem. Money is not a problem. The Bible says, John says in the book of 3 John, verse 2, he says, I wish all of you to prosper and be in good health. God wants us to be prosperous. So money isn't the issue, but it's our relationship to money. But we have to start with the idea that money itself is neutral. It's just simply a symbol of value. Money is a medium of exchange. I work for an hour. I get paid a certain amount that reflects the value of what I've done. Now I can take that and I can buy something of equivalent value to what I spent my time on. So, of course, some people make a little bit more. Some people make a little bit less. The stuff we buy, some of it's a little bit more, a little bit less. But money becomes a very efficient way to exchange, basically, to exchange our time for either a possession or an experience. That's all it is. However, again, we have this emotional relationship with money. And I'm not saying emotional in a bad way. I'm just saying that's human nature. We relate to it fairly emotionally. But here's the question. If money is simply a medium of exchange between our time and either an experience or possession, and all of us here have the same 24 hours a day, do we not? Money or time is finite for us. It's infinite for God, but time is finite for us. So if I have a finite amount of time, I have a finite ability to earn money. Therefore, if I have I can't just make whatever I want. I mean, I can work harder, et cetera, but I only have so much time. How do we maximize the effectiveness of our time, which becomes money? And the way that we maximize that is through something called planning. And so I talked about the fact that we should be planners, and the reason why is not only is it logical, but the Bible talks about how important planning is. And so the Bible says here in Psalms, it says, but the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purpose of his heart through all generations. The plans of the diligent. So we know God is a planner, because it says right there, the plans of the Lord. Does God have plans? Absolutely. Does God have plans for us? Absolutely. It also says, though, not only does God have plans, we should have plans. The plans of the diligent surely lead surely to abundance, but everyone who is hasty comes only to poverty. And then it says, I know God, this is what God is saying in the Old Testament through Jeremiah, I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and hope. God has a plan for us to have a future and to have hope. He cares about what's going on, and one of the ways he manifests that care is he has a plan. And then the last thing it says here, and by the way, I mentioned the fact, this last one in Luke, this is Jesus talking. I believe that everything in the Bible is God-breathed, and it's inspired, and it's worthy for us to use in whatever situation we need. I particularly like what Jesus said, because there's times where people can say, well, if you just kind of understood, I mentioned this last night, did Paul really mean that? I think Paul may have had, and so we kind of debate, what's the real meaning? It's hard to debate what Jesus said. Would that be fair? And so Jesus himself says this, for which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost? Does that sound like planning? Absolutely. count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it. Otherwise, when he has laid the foundation and not able to finish it, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish it. Jesus himself is saying, by the way, you need to count the cost. Just like you would count the cost if you were to build a tower, the context is count the cost when you're going to follow me, because it will cost you. Now, the benefit is eternity, but there is a cost in this lifetime. By the way, that's Jesus is talking there about making an investment, isn't he? If we're willing to pay the price today and get the return later on. So we'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. But what we know here is that God is a planner. We're created in his image. Therefore, we should be planners. And so I have this statement here. Since God believes in planning, we should believe in planning. The Creator planned things out from the foundation of the earth, or from the world. Yet too many believers go to him without doing the diligence of planning. We tend to dodge the reality that God works in concert and in cadence with plans. I have a friend that once said, hey, we're doing some stuff for church. We don't want to do any plans, because how can the Holy Spirit work if we already have plans? And I politely disagreed that God works through those plans. That's where the Holy Spirit can work, is if we're willing to have plans. Sometimes he tells us what those are. Sometimes he lets us make those decisions. But God works in concert and in cadence with plans. In fact, what do we call this? All that we're doing here in church is for one mission. What is it? It's for salvation, is it not? Salvation, we're called to bring the message of salvation to the world. What do we call that? The plan of salvation, don't we? Do we believe that there is a plan for the salvation of this world? Absolutely. Has God enlisted us to be part of it? You bet he has. We find regularly witness him, meaning God in the scriptures, responding to a plan, tweaking a plan, or creating a plan. So if all we have belongs to God and God is a planner, then it would follow that we should have a plan for the money or possessions that God has entrusted to us. Everything that we have, where has it come from? It's come from God, hasn't it? Is there anyone here that did or accomplished anything without being alive? And where did our life come from? It comes from God, the very breath that we have. There is not one thing that we've ever done that ultimately doesn't go back to God. And all that we do, all that we've earned, all that we've made, all that we've accomplished, it is from God. And God is a planner. And it says here, I love this last couple words here. It says, God has entrusted it to us. Do you guys know what that means? It means that originally it was his. He is giving it to us. He is entrusting us to use it according to his will. And the question I have is, if God can trust us with what he's giving us, do we trust God in return? Are we willing to trust God? And so we talked about the fact last night, a lot of times we're like, oh, when it comes to money, hey, God, that's mine. I'm willing to, go do some mission projects periodically, but hey, don't touch my money. But the question is this: is that money really ours? And when we look at it, I love what John Wesley said, hundreds of years ago. Not how much of my money will I give to God, but how much of God's money will I keep for myself? Don't you think that's a better way to look at it? Not how much of my money do I have to give to God, but how much of God's money is it okay for me to keep? And I bring this up because here's the reality, and I'm going to be very direct. We cannot be truly trusting God if we're not paying tithes and offerings. All right? Now, I know, like when I was a kid growing up, it seemed like most people did that. If we look at what's happening in churches in general, tithe paying seems to be getting less and less. We seem to have this idea, I think socially or spiritually, it doesn't really matter. It does matter, because if we're keeping it for ourselves, what we're saying is, I trust that extra money to take care of me more than I trust God to take care of me. And God has made the statement in Malachi where he said, bring all the tithes into the storehouse and see if I will not return to you a blessing that you can't even imagine, more than you could ever deal with. We think that if we keep that little extra money, that we'll have a better shot at having our safety and security, pursuing our dreams, finding love, all that kind of stuff. I believe that when we return to God, we don't give him our money, by the way, because it's not really ours. We're returning to him what he's given us. When we are faithful to return that, I believe that God gives us a blessing. Many times it's a financial blessing. But here's the thing. We don't just want the money. Remember all those emotions I was talking about? What we really want are those things that I discussed. Again, just 3 of them: safety and security, pursuing our dreams, finding love. What if God said, if you're faithful to return to me the tithes and offerings, I will pour out a blessing of safety and security. I will pour out a blessing of you being able to pursue your dreams. I will pour out a blessing of love that you could never get with money alone. Would that be a fair trade? Absolutely. And so what I want us to think about is before we start the process of, how do we get out of debt? How do we make sure we don't get back into it? What do we do with the funds? We need to understand from the beginning, we're not talking about strictly our money. We're talking about what God has blessed us with, entrusted to us. And I want to start with the first question: are we willing to trust him back? I think we should. I know we can. And the question is, remember we talked about people get advice, many times they don't follow it. Are we willing to follow what we know is truth? All right, so we talked a little bit about that. Just to recap then, just because we know it doesn't mean we'll do it. I hope we are different as a group. If we know something, let's try to do it. Now, I'm not going to tell you everything that I talk about you guys have to change, but if you left tonight and tomorrow and you said, here's 2 or 3 things that I think I can start doing, just a couple, it will be a big change. So don't think in terms of I have to do everything starting tomorrow. What is something that you can start tomorrow? What is something maybe the next week? But just 2 or 3 good ideas that you can take in your life. Number 2, money is deeply personal, but is merely a means of exchange. Please don't fall in love with money. Fall in love with God. Let him bless you. And the third thing here, God believes in planning. So, number 1, we need to trust God. Number 2, we need to have a plan. And this is where we wrapped up last night. And so what I'm going to ask you to do as we go forward is do this. If you look in the clipboard, we're going to start talking about how do we have a plan. Now, I'm going to admit here, would you guys rather have me strain to look back there, or is it okay if I just read off of the screen up here? All right. I'm getting to that point. I can kind of see distances, can't read up front, but I'm going to go here. Kingdom stewardship meaning God's kingdom. If we are a steward, meaning we've been entrusted to take care of what God's given to us. That's what a steward is all about. Kingdom stewardship means being real about the condition of your assets. How many of you, I'm not going to ask the question. Many people don't want to actually take a look at what the condition of their finances are because sometimes it's not a pretty picture. But I'm going to encourage you, sometimes we have to open up the drawer. Sometimes we have to pull up the carpet. We have to look at what's underneath. This is what the Bible says in Proverbs 27:23. Know well the condition of your flocks and give attention to your herds. Now, in biblical times, that was how they measured wealth. All right? It wasn't just, hey, how many sheep do I have? How many cows do I have? Whatever. God is saying in Proverbs, know well the condition of your wealth. What is happening with that? And so it goes on. This one verse establishes a basic kingdom stewardship principle for all of us. Pay attention to how well you're doing. Do the hard work of assessment, learning, and application as it relates to whatever ventures you take part of. You must have a plan, and to have a plan, you must clearly comprehend your assets and strategies for growth. So what I'm going to ask you to do is if you would open or go to your clipboard, I think there's a couple pages of notes, places where you can take notes. Sometime here in the next couple of days, if you and your spouse, if you're married, or just you if you're alone, I want you to go through this. And it may look a little complicated, but really what we're trying to do, or you're trying to do, is take a look at 2 things. What do I own? And what have I borrowed? What do I owe? So what do I own? And what do I owe? Now, there's a lot of things we would look at from the ownership perspective. Number 1, what money do you have? Do you have cash on hand? If you've got a piggy bank, you don't have to break the piggy bank. Do you know how much is in there? Do you have some cash sitting in your wallet or in your purse or in a drawer? You want to count that. How much is in your checking or your savings account? Take a look at that. And you can just kind of go through here. If you have any stocks or bonds, if you have a life insurance policy that has some cash value, coins, home. By the way, for many of us, the value of our home is going to be the most significant asset. The top two are generally your home and your retirement account. So those become really key when we're taking a look here. Any other real estate, if you've loaned money to someone else and they're paying you back, that's an asset. You're owed that. So that's an asset that you want to count. If any businesses, automobiles, furniture, jewelry, as Adventists, we probably don't have a whole lot of that. Other personal property, pension, retirement, other assets. But the idea is whatever you have, something that you own that has value. And I'm not talking about sentimental value. I'm talking if you could convert that into a financial value of some kind, you want to put it down. Don't worry if you don't get it all to the exact penny, especially with your home. It's hard to know what your home is worth unless someone actually writes the check, okay? But there's easy places. You can go out on Zillow and it'll tell you your home is worth roughly between here and here. And you can also look at your tax statements each year because it'll say this is what the state thinks it's worth. And I always joke, the state always thinks it's worth more than we do. And so they tax us on it. But the reality is there's several ways that you could get an estimate. Same thing with your car. You could go to Edmunds and you can pull that up and say, here's my vehicle, here's how many miles, here's the options, and it'll tell you about what the value of the car is. The point isn't to be exact to the penny, but you want to be as close as you reasonably can. And when you're done, you add all those things up. And now you know what your total assets are. You know what your assets are worth. But we're not done there. What we need to do next is take a look at what are our liabilities. A net worth statement, by the way, is very simple. Assets minus liabilities. Assets are the things that we own. Our liabilities are the things that we owe. So do we have a mortgage on the house? That one's pretty easy. You can look it up and say, yes, I owe X amount of money on my mortgage. Do we have a car loan? Yeah, okay, how much is that? What's the value of that I still have to pay off? And you can go right on down here. Credit card debt, personal debt to relatives, any business loans, education loans, medical, life insurance loans, bank loans. Anytime that you know that you still owe money to someone or something meaning an institution, write that down. And again, when you're done, add that all up and now you have your total liabilities. And now here's the part where you take a deep breath. What you want is to take the total assets minus the total liabilities and have a positive number. Okay, that's the goal. Now, I will tell you there was a time in my life, number one, when I was in college, but even as an adult, I talked about last night, I've known all this stuff since I was a kid. For those of you here that weren't here last night, my mom, when I was 8 years old, she figured out a way to get my sister and I, my older sister, to get a paper route. We lived in Olathe, Kansas, and I was 8, she was 10, and the minimum age to get a paper route was 12. I don't know how she did it, okay? But that says something about my mom. When we got the paper route, during the week, every weekday, we would deliver the newspaper. We had to fold them in the morning, stuff them. My dad would drive around the neighborhood. We'd be throwing, out the window. Once a month, we would collect all the dues or subscriptions, and then we would pay for the newspapers, and whatever was left, we kept. So we were really independent contractors at the age of 8 and 10. Really profound training at that age. But my mom taught us how to budget, and she said, Jimmy, you're going to have a jar with tithe, offering, savings, clothes, going to summer camp. List goes on. So I knew this stuff as a kid. This was not new. And I got to adulthood, and there was a time, a few years after college, where I was starting to accumulate assets, and I still owed more than I owned. It's not hard for that to happen, even if we know what we're supposed to know. I've done a lot of things right, and I've done more than I'd like to admit wrong. But that's life. And the question is, once we know better, let's do better. So we're going to go through this. I'm not going to do it with you, but you're going to go through it. Here's my assets. Here's my liabilities. And now you know this is my financial condition today. For some of us, that might be really good news. Yay, things are looking great. For some of us, it might be, wow, I didn't realize. I'm not sure if I feel good about it. But here's why we do that first. Because once we know what our condition is, now we need to decide what we're going to do going forward. And as we take a look at going forward, the next step is we need to have a budget. Budgets are critical. Now, a lot of times people are upset and say, hey, I don't want a budget. That's like putting my money in jail. I can't do whatever I want with it. The reality is you can put together any budget you want. No one's telling you what it has to be. But what I'm going to tell you is unless you end up with a budget where at the end of the month you have spent a little bit less than what you made, you're going backwards. Now, that doesn't mean that anyone's going to tell you that Sarah and I like to joke a little bit with the younger generation. You can still get your avocado toast if you need that, all right? No one's going to stop you. You can still stop at Starbucks anytime you want. But the budget is where you decide where do my assets or where does my income go. We talked about assets. This is talking about income. Now, one of the things you're going to find looking at this sample is I love using this one because it incorporates our tithes and offerings immediately. All right? So we get paid. Maybe we have some money in a savings account that's paying us or some stocks and bonds that's paying us. We're going to take a look at what our total income is for the month, and then we're going to subtract out our tithe and giving and also our taxes. By the way, do we have any control on taxes? No, we don't. Yeah, we do if we want to go to jail, but the reality is that the government requires us to give to them a certain amount of money. And we do it. We complain about it, but we still do it. My hope is that before the government gets theirs, even though technically they're taking it right out of our paycheck, but the very first thing we do is say, you know what, God, if I'm willing to have given to the government, I will gladly give to you or return to you. So this budget incorporates that. And now after our tithe and our giving, after our taxes, we have something that's called net spendable income. This is now the amount that we have the flexibility on. And before I go any farther, does that make sense to everyone? Does anyone have a question? I don't want to go too fast. All right, we're all good? Okay. We then need to take a look at where will this money go? How many of us here are either in a home that we're buying or we're renting? Probably most of us. All right, we need to incorporate those expenses. One of the first things we need to do is say, I need to pay for either my mortgage or my rent. Those are really critical. There's other items in here too. We probably want to pay for electricity and gas. It's, bad things happen in the middle of the winter if you don't have heat. All right, we probably need some kind of communication like a phone. But we put down, here's how much I need to spend in some of these categories. And you're going to go through each one of these. Now, here's something I'm going to ask you guys to write down. Everyone's budget is different, but there are similarities based on where we are in our age and where we are in terms of family size. So a young couple that doesn't have kids yet is going to have a different budget than two parents with 3 children at home who are going through education, and they will be different than perhaps a single person in retirement. Does that follow? How we allocate percentages in these different categories. So what I'm going to ask you to do, if you're really wanting to get some feedback, some of you here can figure this out on your own, but if you're like, hey, are there some samples that I can look at that are relevant for me in my situation, go to a website called crown.org or O-R-G. Crown Financial Ministry, this was one of the original financial or Christian financial planning. Anyone here heard of Larry Burkett? Before there was, thank you. Before there was Dave Ramsey, there was Larry Burkett. And Crown Ministry, what I love about Crown Ministry is that they're very fundamentally solid with their planning. But more so, they're so fundamentally solid biblically. It's very easy for people to say, I believe in God and we should do these things. But a lot of times, and I don't want to be critical, especially if I'm on tape here, Dave Ramsey, I would say I believe with most everything he says, but I don't know that he brings it back biblically as much as I would like. And Crown does a great job with that. So I would invite you guys to go there if you're looking for a place. If you already know where you want to look for some information, great. But if you needed a place to start, that's a great one. So what I'm going to ask you to do at some point, and we're not going to do it tonight, But I want to get you guys started that at some point you need to know, where is my money going? Money has a funny way of telling us where it's going to go. Does it feel like that? By the end of the month, it's like, yeah, where'd my money go? Well, it didn't feel like I decided. Well, then who did? Well, it felt like the money decided. It's just gone. If we want to be the master of the money, we decide how it's spent. Now, again, that doesn't mean that we can't do fun things. It just means that we have a plan for how it goes out. And this becomes critical because in order for us to take the next step, most of us here, either tonight or at one time in our life, had debt. And I will be honest that at one time I had what I would consider to be rather significant debt. And I had to figure out how to get out of debt. And the only way you do that is you spend less than you make. Now, I want to tell you a kind of an important concept. I just figured this out a few years ago. So Sarah and I have done an Ironman triathlon. Are you guys familiar with what that is? Ironman triathlon. Okay, I've actually done 3. The last one I did, Sarah did with me. She was amazing, by the way. I can't say enough great things about her. But here's what would happen. So we're training, and if you guys don't know what an Ironman is, it's a one-day event, and you swim 2.4 miles. You hop out of the water, you get on a bike, and you bike 112. Now, we did it in Chattanooga, where it was actually 116, but we were swimming downriver, so they figured, it's equal. So, but we swam 2.4 miles in the river, 116-mile bike ride, and when you get off the bike, now you run a full marathon, 26.2 miles, and you have 16 and a half hours to do it. And the goal is to do it in less. So you're training. We started probably 7-8 months before, and we were training maybe a little bit more. We did it in September, and so by June, July, and August, we've ramped up that training, and we're probably training 12 to 15 hours a week, and Sunday was the big bike ride. And so we would bike, 100 miles, 110, 120 miles, and get done. And after 7 or 8 hours of being on the bike, you get done, and you're gassed. I mean, you're tired, right? And you're hungry. And so we would get back to the house, and we'd be like, what do you want to do? Well, I'm too tired to do anything. Let's just get some pizza, right? So we would call up Jet's Pizza. We would get the deep dish because we just biked for 8 hours. I mean, don't we deserve it? I mean, we burned all those calories. And so we would just sit around in the evening, and we would eat our Jet's Pizza and maybe a little bowl of ice cream. Okay, and so here's the fun. It's hilarious, but we're a couple weeks or a month or two into it. They're like, how are we gaining weight? I mean, we're exercising. This is not like, hey, I'm going to walk leisurely for a half hour a day. This is hardcore. Swimming straight for an hour, biking. I would do the 120 miles, and I might stop twice at 40 miles and at 80 miles just to replenish my Gatorade, and within 3 minutes I'm back on the bike, and so it's solid, and you're running 15, 17 miles. I mean, it's hardcore stuff. How in the world are we gaining weight? And I came to the conclusion, you cannot exercise your way out of a bad eating plan. Am I right? We learned it firsthand. You cannot exercise your way out of a bad eating plan. And the point that I want to make is you cannot earn your way out of a bad spending plan. Many times people, as we're talking about debt here coming up, people say, well, if I just made some more money, I'm spending a little bit too much here, but if I just made some more money, I'm going to be fine. The issue is what we're spending. Just like for, not Sarah, I mean, she's gorgeous, right? For me, I was eating too much, and it was the stuff that I shouldn't have been eating. When we're spending too much money on the things that we really shouldn't, that's how we get in trouble. And so what I encourage us is when we're looking at our finances, if we're like, boy, I wish I made more money so I could have the things that I want. The issue is not more money, because when we get more money, we will still spend it. We need to get in control of how we're spending our money, and we need to do that with where we're at right now. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so the budget becomes really critical. My goal for you as you're looking through this is you need to come up with a reasonable budget that at the end of the month, you have accounted for where your money goes and you're not spending more than what you're making. If you're spending more than what you're making, you're going backwards. we need to be spending less than what we're making. So let's move on here a little bit. We talked about we need to trust God, we need to have a plan. And so number 3, how to get and stay out of debt. We talked about this already. You can't be the master if you're already the servant. If God is our master, money cannot be. And debt has a funny way of becoming a master in our life. When the Bible talks quite a bit about this. In fact, let's look at what the Bible says about debt. Number 1, Romans, this is Paul talking. He says, "Owe no one anything except to love one another, for the one who loves another has fulfilled the law." So Paul's saying, don't owe each other money other than owing each other the debt of gratitude and love. In Proverbs, do not be among those who give pledges, among those who become guarantors for debt. For if you have nothing with which to pay, why should he take your bed from under you? So not only should we not go into debt, but the Bible gives a very good instruction that says, don't guarantee someone else's debt as well. Now, it seems like kind of a no-brainer, but sometimes these things happen, and even our kids will come to us, and a couple of ours are like, "Hey, Dad, can you?" And I was like, I'd love to, but this is really bad. It's not a good idea. So the Bible says don't become a guarantor. Don't guarantee someone else's debt, because if you're the guarantor, what reason do they have to pay it off? They just walk away. You're the one that's left holding the loan. A couple other things. It says the rich rules over the poor, and the borrower becomes the lender's slave. That's pretty powerful language. So if we're in debt, is God our master or is the lender our master? The lender is. A prudent man sees evil and hides himself. The naive proceed and pay the penalty. And then last, he who is a guarantor for a stranger will surely suffer for it. We kind of talked about this. But he who hates being a guarantor is secure. The Bible talks about not being in debt. Now, here's what's interesting. The Bible never says it's a sin. I have not found one text in the Bible that says having debt is a sin. But of all the times that it talks about debt in the Bible, it never once talks about it positively. It always is a negative connotation. Now, some of us, most of us here probably could not buy a home without going into debt. And I count myself in that same category. So there are some times where debt can be prudent. And I'll tell you 3 of them where I think that if it's done very judiciously and carefully, can make a lot of sense. Number 1, buying a home. We're going to be paying either rent someplace, making a payment, or paying a mortgage for a home. It makes a lot of sense to be using that money to actually be purchasing an asset. Now, I do know that right now that's more difficult than it used to be. The cost for a home plus the higher interest rate, the studies right now is it's cheaper to rent than it is to buy. It used to be cheaper to buy than it was to rent, but that's really reversed itself. At some point, hopefully the mortgage rates still keep coming down a little bit. There may be a bit of a bubble in real estate, but I'm not going to make predictions. But the idea is that if someone would say, wow, Jim's talking a lot about debt, but I have a mortgage, should I feel guilty about that? I would not feel guilty. Now, that doesn't mean that the average person should have $1 million home or $1 million mortgage, because we can't afford that. But having a reasonable home and a reasonable mortgage, I think, is still prudent. The second place where I think it could be prudent is if we do not have any means of transportation to get us to a job. And if we had some type of reliable transportation, buying a car, that could allow us to go to work or even have a better job that allows us more income. So I think that at times, again, judiciously and very carefully, having a car loan can be a benefit because it allows us to get a better income. And so that's something where I think, but again, not all of us need a Mercedes to get to work, right? Okay. I'm not saying they're not great cars. I'm just saying if we're being prudent wherever our situation is in life, and it's different for everyone, we need to be prudent with what God has given us. The third one where I think it can be prudent, but again, we have to be careful, especially since this one can get way out of control. You guys want to know what the largest debt in the country is? One of the largest debt? It's, what's that? Education, exactly. Now, I'm a believer that investing in ourselves, I think the greatest asset that we will ever have is ourselves. And so for someone to say, I want to go to school, and I'm willing to judiciously, prudently borrow to get some education, that can work. But the problem is a lot of people, they just stay in school over, and they've been there 10, 15 years. They owe hundreds of thousands of dollars, and now they're going to work and they're making $30,000 a year, and there's no way they can ever pay it off, all right? That's a terrible way to use education debt. But there are prudent times. Like anything else, it can be done wisely and it can be done foolishly. But those are the 3 times where I think that if we're trying to be intelligent, we could say, I'm still being prudent and using debt. But we don't need to use a credit card to go on vacation. Can we be honest about that? We shouldn't be using a credit card in order for us to buy groceries or put gas in the car. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't emergencies that happen. We're going to talk about how to avoid that so we don't have to go into debt. But the reality is, we don't need, the extra things are not things we put on debt. We may have a mortgage on our house, and they'll try to sell you, oh, you should have a home equity line of credit. What if you need some money sometime? Oh, that'd be a great idea. And so people use it like an ATM, and they keep borrowing against the value of their home. Their home value goes up, but so does their debt. And at some point, things happen, home value drops, and now you're underwater. So I'm a big believer in not using home equity lines of credit or home equity loans. But anyway, the Bible talks about debt. It's never a sin, but it's never positive. And so how do we get and stay out of debt? Because that's really the big question, isn't it? What do we do so that we can get out and stay out of debt? But I'm going to pause for a second. Do you guys have any questions from anyone that you feel comfortable asking that you would like to have answered? Does that make sense, or did I go too fast through that? Yes, go ahead. She didn't beat me, but she did extremely well. She did extremely well. But I'll just do like 3 minutes. You guys, I'm not going to tell anyone that you should or shouldn't, but wouldn't you agree, it was just an amazing experience. Every one of us, here's what I'm going to encourage you guys. I remember early in my career, coming out of college, someone said something once, and they said, everyone should have a goal big enough to be afraid of. It's a really neat thing to say, I want to try to do something, and I don't think I can do it, but I still want to try. Now, I'm taking us outside the realm of finances. But when you do something like that, whether it's running a marathon or one of the things that Sarah and I did also, I had done it once before, but we did it together. We hiked from the top of the Grand Canyon down to the Colorado River and then back up maybe 9 hours or something. When you do something that you don't know that you can do, because I remember the first time, how many here have been to the Grand Canyon? Okay, so we've got maybe a third. Am I right? When you get there, it's just awe-inspiring. Like, pictures do not do it credit, right? You look at it as like, wow, this is just unbelievable. And I had gone there. I'd never been there before, but I knew I was going out to Arizona for a conference, and I said, I'm going to hike the Grand Canyon down to the river and back up, because I had heard that people do that. And so I'd done some studies, and I kind of had it all planned out. And I get there the night before, and I'm looking at it, and I'm like, this is unbelievable. How in the world am I going to do this? And I thought about just saying, no, because there's signs everywhere. If you guys have hiked the Grand Canyon, there's signs with this guy down on his hands and knees, he's sunburned back, and he's just puking, okay? Because the problem in the Grand Canyon is people don't plan. They haven't exercised, they haven't trained, they're not bringing water, they get heat exhaustion. People die in the Grand Canyon from dehydration and from sunstroke. They don't die because they fall off. I mean, sometimes that happens, but the people that are getting rescued every day are the ones that haven't planned. And so I was like, wow, this is serious stuff. There's signs everywhere. Don't attempt this. Am I doing something too dangerous? Well, I decided, I had trained. I was on top of it. I knew what to do. So I hiked down to the bottom, got back up to the top. Awesome experience to say I'm going to do something that I was kind of afraid of doing. It was bigger than what I thought I could do. Same thing with the Ironman, the first time I did that. And by the way, Sarah's done several half Ironmans as well. And anyway, I'll stop talking about how amazing she is. She's tired of me talking about how amazing she is. But anyway, so you do these things, and the first time, you may start small. Like the first time was, I'm going to try to do a 5K. And I was like, wow, that was really great. And then I did a 10K a few years later. And then I did my first small triathlon. When you do something that you don't know you can do, when you're done, you feel like you can do anything. Everyone needs a goal big enough to be afraid of, because I think all of us need to experience that when we're done, we say, you know what? I think I can do anything. And so when we come to things like this in finance where we say, you know what? I may not have made all the right decisions, and I can see now I need to get back on track and do some things, but you know what? I remember I did something hard that I didn't think I could do, and I did it. I believe in myself, and I know I can do this too. And so that's why I encourage you guys, outside of what we're talking about here, if there's something that's on your bucket list where you're like, you know what, I really wish I could do that, do it. Be willing to try something that you're a little afraid of. It's life-changing. Absolutely life-changing. Great experience. So let's talk about how do we get and stay out of debt. Number one, the only way you get out of debt is to have a budget. Now, some people can kind of do a budget in your mind. My sister, my older sister, by the way, she goes to the grocery store, and you know what she does? This is the same one that we did the paper outs together. As she's collecting the groceries into her cart, she's adding up. And her goal, when she gets to check out, she wants to be within $1 of what the total price is. And she usually is. I mean, she's just, with numbers, just amazing. She drives me nuts sometimes, but she's amazing. Some people have the ability to say, I can keep track in my mind of everything that I've spent. Most of us can't. And so I would encourage you, we need to have a budget that says, here's how I want to spend the money, but we also then need to keep track of it. Now, Sarah, if I can, we've kind of divided up the finances a little bit. Sarah takes care of all the fun things. And I mean that honest, like she can go grocery shopping, she gets the clothes, we need something around the house. I pay all the bills. I do the serious, not the heavy lifting, but the kind of serious stuff and let her do the fun stuff. I track everything in Quicken. That's how I keep track of it. She keeps track of it because she has different accounts, and if she gets something, she spends from that account. And when the money's gone in that account, she doesn't spend anymore. There isn't necessarily a bad way. So I could tell you this is what I do. She could tell you this is what she does. You may have something else. But we need to know what is our plan for how we spend the money. And then number two, we need to keep track of it. Because again, the money says, well, if you're not keeping track of where I'm going to go wherever I want. Money seems to have a mind of its own. It really doesn't, but it seems to it. So have a budget, keep track of it, and then this is what's really important. We need to spend less than we make. And for a lot of us, the only way that's going to happen is we're going to have to start cutting out unnecessary expenses. Most of us, if we're honest, if we took a look at how we spend our money, we would say, there's some things in here that I don't absolutely have to have. And we'll talk a little bit about what some of those might be. But here's the other interesting thing. By the way, if you want to know what your priorities are in life, if you keep track of what you spend your money at the end of the year, you add up how much you've spent in each category, you will know within 15 seconds what your priorities are in life. If you want to know what's important to someone, look at where they spend their money. And I think it's a great experience for all of us to take a look at the end of the year. This is how I spent my money. And then we can ask ourselves honestly, is that really the priorities that I think that I have? And if not, what are some of the changes that I need to make? So, number one, have a budget. Number two, after you've had the budget, spend less than what you make by cutting out unnecessary expenses. Number three, establish an emergency fund. You guys, most problems happen because an emergency happens and we don't have funds. And all of a sudden, we're down this slippery slope. I blew out a tire and I didn't have an emergency fund. It's going to cost $500 to get another set. Where am I going to find? Well, I got to put it on the credit card because I didn't have any emergency money. Now we've started a process and it's so easy. Well, I have another small emergency. That goes on the credit card. And it starts snowballing in a negative way. So having an emergency fund becomes really critical. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about the specifics on that. And then most importantly, when we have a budget, when we've cut out the unnecessary expenses, so we have a little extra each month, and we're safe if there's an emergency, now what we need to do is use the difference between what you make and what you spend to pay down your debt. Does that make sense? Now here's the honesty. Understanding this is a lot easier than doing it. All right? The Bible talks about the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Paul talks about even spiritually, the things that I want to do, I don't do. The things that I don't want to do, I do. This happened. If you found yourself in a situation like that financially, most of us are like that. That's just human nature. But what I'm going to encourage us is that we need to have a disciplined mindset that says, if I have a little extra, I need now to pay down that debt because I want to be the master of the money and I want Jesus to be the master of me. So how do we do this? There's something called a snowball method. Any of you here heard of the snowball method? Okay. We have some information here. Again, if you go to your handouts, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about how this works. And by the way, this works phenomenally well. And I tell you that not because I've read it. When I finally decided, I think I was 33. And I came to the conclusion, you know what, for the last few years, I have not been doing this right. And I had accumulated debt. And I was spending money on things that I didn't need to spend. And I said, that's it. This needs to stop. And I personally followed this strategy. And it works. So the number one thing that I want you to do is if you have more debt than what you need, and that's a lot of us, and you're wanting to pay it down, the very first thing that we need to do is we need to write down what debts do we have and put down as much information as you can. But you're going to categorize it. Actually, there's two forms here. There's the debt list and then something called debt repayment schedule. Either one of them are going to work. I'm just showing you the debt list. But if it's whoever the creditor is, we've got here auto loans, home mortgages, business or investment debt, regular creditors, which would be, most of the time, that's credit cards or personal loans that we borrowed from other people. But I want you to write down all of the debt. As you think about it, you just write it down, put on any information, how much you borrowed, how much is still outstanding, how much you're paying, what the interest rate is, all that kind of information. You need to know what your debts are. And so you write it all down. Any questions on that? All right. So the next step then is, once you've written it all down, once you've gathered all your debt, and it may take a little bit of time. You need to go to bank statements. Credit cards aren't that hard because you get a statement every month. Your mortgage, you can either go online or usually once a year they're sending you, maybe once a month, but once a year they're sending you an annual statement. You can find that out. Car loan, you might have to do a little checking with your bank. But get accurate about the amount of debt it is because it becomes very important at the third or fourth step here. Maybe at the second step. So step 2. We've listed all of our debt, correct? So with all of the debt listed, now what we want to do on the page called Snowball Strategy, when you've listed all of your debt, I want you to take a look at everything that's on this list, and I want you to find the smallest amount of debt. Maybe it's $25, maybe it's $250, maybe it's $2,000, whatever it is. When you look here, what is the smallest debt that you have? And you're going to write that down, number 1. Okay? Make a list, order your debt from the smallest to the largest. Once you've written that first one down, now find the next smallest debt on this list and write it down. That would be awesome if we could stop right there, correct? For many of us, and I was in this boat, then you go to number 3. What's the next smallest? And the next smallest, and the next smallest. And so you'll go on this list from the smallest, you'll look here, but you'll write it down here, the smallest to the largest, whatever it is. You don't worry necessarily about what the interest rate is or what the payment is. Those are important, but it's not as important for the categorizing as the size of the debt. Once you've done that, step number 3 is find extra money anywhere you can. Now, for some of us, finding that extra money is going to be maybe breaking open a piggy jar, but there's so many things that we can do that find extra money. One of the things that I used to do when I did more of the purchasing of things, I was like a coupon nerd. All right, I loved a sale. In fact, the joke is, when my kids were younger, When I grew up, we didn't have a lot of money for extras, and so to have like snack crackers to bring to school, we never had that. I would go to the store, and it's like Myers up in Michigan, and Cheez-Its were on sale. I was like, wow, my kids are going to love this. Well, after about 3 years, I realized Cheez-Its are on sale every single week, but it was still a deal, so I would buy the Cheez-Its. But I would find coupons, and I would keep track of how much money I saved in the coupons, and I would make an allocation, and that is how much that became my vacation budget. I could go on vacation. It wasn't a huge vacation. I wasn't going to the South Pacific or anything like that, but I could go on vacation just with my savings or my M-Perks. You spend a certain amount at Myers and you get some stuff back. I would set that all aside, and I would use that as a way of funding vacation. You guys use that as a way, $50, $100 a month, I bet you could find by setting aside this extra money. One of the other things I did, again, I'm a numbers nerd. I would take every transaction that I had for the month and I would round it up in my mind, and I would keep track of it. And at the end of the month, all that rounding up, I would add up, and it would be an extra $40, $50, and that would go over into that same category. So find little things where you can find the pennies or the small dollars. They add up over time. So find money wherever you can. And then step number 4 is pay everything that you can on your smallest debt. That first one that's on the line there, again, maybe it's only $50 or $100, maybe it's just a couple thousand, whatever it is, every penny that you can find extra, excuse me, you've reduced your income, so you have a few extra dollars a month. You're finding all this extra money through little, I don't know if you want to call them games, but little things you can do. You spend every penny and you pay off that debt. When you're done, when the smallest debt is gone, you take that payment that you were paying on that debt. Let's call it $50 a month. They were paying on that small debt. And you now start applying that to your next smallest debt. Follow? Plus all that money that you were, every month you were finding and you were putting into that first debt, you take all of that plus that payment, and now you roll it to the next smallest debt. And when that's paid off, then you take all that money that you were paying on that debt, which was the first debt plus the second debt plus the extra money, and you keep repeating that until you're debt-free. And the amazing thing that you're going to find is that it feels like every few months you're getting to cross off another debt. And the feeling is so empowering. I paid off a debt, and I'm on my way to paying off the next one and the next one. And I didn't have hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt that I had to pay down, but it was still a decent amount. And within 2 years, I had paid it all off just by following this. The system works. Now, some people make the comment, really, you should pay off whatever the highest interest rate is first. And I would tell you, if someone's told you that, that's not necessarily a bad plan. If, excuse me, if people are saying, hey, there's 2 or 3 great ways, and I think my way is better, people will follow it, no problem. But here's why I think this is probably the best way for most people, is because you get the greatest satisfaction the fastest. And people have a tendency to do what works. And the quicker you can find success, the more likely you are to stay with it. And the goal is, in order for this to be successful, you have to stay with it. It's kind of like reading the Bible. By the way, I'm a big believer that there are some versions of the Bible that are perhaps more accurate to the original writing. We talk about the King James, New King James Version, etc. Sometimes people say, what's the best version of the Bible? Ultimately, if I want people to get to know Jesus through the Bible, the best version is the one that they will read. Am I right? Now, as they get to know Jesus Christ and they're reading the Bible, we may say, there's another version that's maybe a little bit more accurate as we're looking at some of the fine stuff. But if someone was to say, I can't understand the King James, that doesn't make any sense to me, but when I read the Revised Standard Version, it seems to make a lot of sense. Or the NIV, it makes a lot of sense. Friends, read the NIV. You know what I'm saying? Read the Bible. And as you come to know Jesus, we can get to some of the more specific things. Hopefully, Pastor, I'm not saying something that goes against what you believe. I apologize. I should have asked you that first. But the goal is, I believe that there are things that are good and better. And if someone asked me, when you're paying off your debt, is it better to pay off the higher interest first? Technically, yes. But if you give up, it's not the best way. And so if you can pay off and get success early on by having said, I'm going to pay the smallest one off as quick as I can, I feel successful, and I am excited and I'm going forward, I would rather have someone spent a couple extra dollars in interest over a couple of years than to have given up in the middle. And so that's why I think for most people, this is the best way to start. So what we want to start with is make a list of those debts, put the smallest one at the top, pay everything you can towards it. When you're done paying that off, you take that payment, add it to the next bottom one, and you keep snowballing. By the time you're done, if you have 5 or 6 loans, your last loan, there's a ton of money that you're paying every month to pay that down. Even if it's a large amount, it's coming down quickly. All right. The last thing I'm going to mention, then we'll open up for some general questions. In order to keep from going into debt, we can't let a tragedy derail us. Most people here, if you're driving a car, you're required to have car insurance. Am I right? Would that be the law here in Kentucky? You have to have auto insurance? Okay. If you have a mortgage on your home, the bank is going to require you to have homeowners insurance. Most people here have health insurance. Many people don't think about life insurance. And I'm not here to try to sell life insurance, but what I will tell you is this. Especially if you're a primary earner in the family, okay? So when my kids were younger, I was a primary earner. I was the only income coming in. If I die, things change dramatically, very dramatically. And debt is almost guaranteed. So what I encourage people is there's another form here. Take a look. I do not believe it's a sin for us to have life insurance. Some people would argue that they think that it is, that we should simply have faith and trust in God. I absolutely believe that we should have faith and trust in God. I also believe that if there's a train coming and I'm lying on the railroad tracks and I say, I believe God is going to get me off the tracks, and God knows I can just get up and walk off, He may not levitate me off the tracks. I don't want to tempt God, all right? God has given us provision to take care of some of these things. And so I believe, if someone has a fundamental disagreement, I'm not going to try to change your mind. I believe, though, that life insurance, to preserve the income-producing ability of a primary earner, is a very appropriate expenditure. And it can prevent some really serious problems financially if we do that. But again, like everything else, you can do it prudently and you can do it very imprudently. So I have a form here that if you want to take a look at, just gives you a little idea how to look at that to know, am I looking at this correctly? Or how should I be considering that? So, just a little bit of summary, and then I'll answer any questions that you guys have. I left a little bit of time for that. Tonight, as we looked at this, number one, debt is not prohibited, but it should be avoided. Do you understand the difference? It's not a sin, but it's always regarded biblically as being something negative. So there are times, again, where I think it's prudent. We need to be very cautious and careful about it. We need to be in control of it, not let it be in control of us. But as much as possible, let's avoid debt. By the way, one of my favorite texts, as the stuff that we've done athletically, I've come to believe, number one, I think, maybe I'll ask the pastor this before I get in trouble. I think that some people think that Paul may have written the book of Hebrews. Is that right? Okay, so we're on the right track. Paul, other times, talks about, so I run the race not to get the crown of leaves, but to get the crown in heaven. I don't box just the air. I box with purpose. Either Paul was an athlete or he was used to what was going on. And many of us forget, by the way, that they were doing Olympics back in Jesus' time. The Olympics started, I think, maybe 100, 150 years before with the Greeks. Maybe they weren't doing the actual Olympics, but there was a lot of athletic events going on in Jesus' day. Paul would have known about that. And so he writes about it because it's the things that he knows. I like to think that he was an athlete. And in Hebrews 12:1, he says, therefore, since we're surrounded by such a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside the weight that encumbers, or lay aside the weight and anything that encumbers us, and let us run with endurance the race set before us. Okay? Debt is a weight. Paul is saying in the spiritual life, let's get rid of the weight that encumbers us. When we were doing the Ironman, the triathlon, one of the things I would take a look at is, are there things I can do on the bike that makes it just a little bit lighter so I can be more efficient? And by the way, the most efficient or the effective way of lightening your bike, by the way, is getting rid of a few pounds on the rider. They talk about that. People will do anything they can. If I could just save 2 ounces, with this different pedal or whatever. You guys just don't eat molten lava chocolate cake, which is one of my struggles. So the Bible tells us in the same way that Paul says spiritually, let's get rid of the weight that's holding us down, the things that are ensnaring us, and let's run with endurance the race that's put before us. Debt is a weight. Debt ensnares us. And so I think we can take that same principle and say, even though it's not a sin, let's avoid it as much as we can. Number 2, be very, very, very wary of being a personal guarantor for someone else's debt. All right? Don't be on the hook for someone else's decision. Because if you're on the hook, they're going to walk away from it. Number 3, use the snowball method to pay off debt. And we've talked about that. I can answer some questions in a minute if we need to. And then number 4, use insurance appropriately to avoid the financial disasters that lead to debt. Number 1, we want to avoid it, or if we have it, we want to get rid of it. And then number 2, when we've gotten rid of it, let's make sure it doesn't come back. And being prudent with insurance. Again, health insurance is another way that people can get into trouble. So you want to make sure you've got health insurance as well. So that's the summary. And so I'm going to just pause here. Actually, I'm going to stop. We're a couple minutes before the end. We were scheduled to go from 7 to 8:30 tonight, right? So I'm still on. Okay, good. Do you guys have any questions? I know we kind of went through that. Hopefully it wasn't too quick, but are there any specific questions that I can ask? And if you don't want to ask them now, I'm going to hang out afterwards, and you can come up, and I'm happy to talk to you. But go ahead, Rebecca. Oh, yeah. Great question. So there's, and by the way, my very first job out of college, I thought I was a financial planner. And after 6 months, I realized that every solution was a life insurance policy. And that's how I figured out, I guess I'm really a life insurance agent. But I was still doing some planning. Here's what I would tell you, the difference between whole life and term life. A term life policy is you're paying exactly what the risk is. Now, at the age of 20, as a 20-year-old male, I had a fairly low risk. At 21, it might be a little bit higher. 22, as my age gets older, by the time I'm 65, I'm much more likely to be a risk for life insurance. And so my premium has changed accordingly. Now, sometimes you can get term life and you're paying that for 10 years level or 20 years. But the idea is you're simply paying for the risk of whether you live or die. That's all it is. So it's very, very efficient. A whole life policy says, you know what? This is a policy that you're going to probably keep your entire life. You're going to pay your premiums from now until you're age 65 or 70. But as you're paying them, you're going to be paying extra every month, and it's going to start accumulating a cash value. So it's kind of like insurance and an investment all baked into one. And there are people that say that's really the best way to go. Other people that say, no, buy term, and if you're going to invest on your own on the side. I tend to be on that side of the equation as well. But that's really the difference, is that whole life has an investment component baked in, whereas term life, so whole life is fairly expensive. Usually it could be 3 to 4 times the amount of term life. And so for most people, I look at insurance and say, you want to insure against something negative happening that prevents an asset from producing, which, my life. At some point, I don't need to insure it anymore. When my kids were younger and I knew we wanted to send them to school, the mortgage is much higher now than it is now, less savings. I wanted much more insurance because that needed to cover the next, let's call it, 20 years. Well, I'm getting closer to retirement. Should I still have some insurance? Yeah, it probably doesn't hurt, but it needs to be less, and I'm only going to need it for a few more years because then at some point, we're just enjoying life, all right? So term life is a very efficient way to go. Whole life becomes 3 to 4 times more expensive, but it does accumulate some savings in there. And some people think it's a good way to go because it's kind of a forced savings. Again, I lean towards the term, but I'm not going to criticize someone for having the whole life. So great question. Anyone else have a question that you'd like to ask? So tell me, is it so confusing that you don't know where to start, or hopefully it was fairly clear? How many? Was it clear enough? Okay, excellent. Thank you, guys. Well, let's do this. Let's end with prayer, and I'm going to stick around because a lot of times, again, we talked about at the beginning, money is very personal to us. And so I'm very respectful of the fact that it's hard to ask questions publicly because you don't want everyone to know what's going on. And hopefully, without having to ask publicly, you're comfortable enough to ask me privately. If you're not, that's fine too. But I at least want to be here so if you guys have questions, you can ask. But let's do this. Let's end with prayer, and then we'll go into the questions on a personal basis. Dear God, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here tonight as we've studied and learned. Lord, help us to go away tonight knowing, number one, that we trust you, that all of this has meaning, but only meaning to the extent that we've given our hearts to you, that we believe that following you, we will always be doing the right thing, and that you have promised no matter what to take care of us. We recognize that in taking care of us, you've given us wisdom, you've given us knowledge, and you've asked us to act on that wisdom and knowledge, and that's what we're doing here tonight, is talking about what you would have us to do. I pray that you will bless us, Lord, that you will encourage each of us as we leave here to know the condition of our flocks, to understand what it is that you've given to us, to take care of those assets, and to look at how can we improve the finances that you've entrusted to us as part of our testimony that we have our trust in you. Bless us to that end, I pray, in Jesus' holy name, amen.